I'm here to express my welcome to all of you joining us very early in the morning on the East Coast or very late in the evening in Japan. This topic is, you might have thought that this topic is something that's relatively recent or new, that there was an Immigration Act that Japan embarked upon on April 1st, 2019, where they amended the Immigration Control Act to open its doors to lower skilled and semi-skilled foreign workers. Also, you might have thought that it's relatively recent because of some controversy surrounding Naomi Osaka's Twitter statements, and also the Black Lives Matters and the treatment of that in Japanese media. But I think the important point that we want to raise, and we have an excellent panel to discuss this, that is not a new issue. And as Professor Michael Sharpe, who assembled this wonderful panel and will be moderator today, mentioned in the Weatherhead East Asian Institute website that I'm trying to plug to all of you right now, interview, is that it shows more of a denial and consequential reinforcement of racism in Japanese society. And also, Professor Sharpe is writing a book on racism and anti-racism in Japan, so that's very important. But also, it's another point that is not a new issue, which is something that this excellent panel will discuss today, is that Japan is not a homogeneous country, and the racism there in other East Asian countries is just pronounced as in the West. It simply manifests itself a bit differently, which is another quote from Professor Sharpe. At this point, I like to ask, invite everybody to speak, but also for us as who are going to be listening to the presenters today about how different and why Japan's immigration policy is the way it is, the racism pronounces itself in the way it does, and what is the future of immigration and racism in Japan. So as I mentioned, we're lucky to have an excellent moderator and a wonderful panel of Professor Abe, Professor Sharpe, and Professor Farrer and Chung. And I must mention that Professor Farrer and Professor Chung has books published this year in 2020. And that's amazing considering what we've been going through all over the world. And we're very excited and lucky to hear from them about their new books. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the mic to the moderator and Professor Michael Sharpe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hikotani, for the very warm welcome. Again, my name is Michael Sharpe. I'm a research scholar here at Columbia's Weatherhead East Asia Institute. I'm also an associate professor of political science. That's my day job, or my main job, at York College of the City University of New York. And so, again, I'll be your moderator. But before I do that, let me introduce our panel. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our exciting panel today. And for this very important and I think under-discussed topic of immigration and racism in Japan. First, I want to introduce Dr. Atsuko Abe of Oberlin University. She is a professor of political science and international relations in their College of Arts and Sciences. Her PhD is from Cambridge in the UK, and she actually went back there to the UK in between 2010 and 2011 as a visiting scholar at the Center on Migration Policy and Society, and also as a visiting fellow at the Wilson College, Oxford. Her recent focus is on migrant domestic workers and feminist political theory. Next, we have Dr. Erin Chung of Johns Hopkins University. She is the Charles D. Miller Associate Professor of East Asian Politics in the Department of Political Science there. She previously served as the director of the East Asian Studies Program and co-director of the Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship Program at Hopkins. She specializes in East Asian political economy, international migration, and comparative racial politics. She is the author of Immigration and Citizenship in Japan, published by Cambridge, 2010, and which was translated by Professor Abe in 2012. Her most recent book is, and congratulations, is on immigrant incorporation in East Asian democracies, also published by Cambridge. She is co-editor of the Politics and Society of East Asia Elements series at Cambridge. Her research has been supported by grants from the Academy of Korean Studies, the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, the Social Science Research Council and the American Council of Learned Societies. Okay, next we have Dr. Gracia Liu-Farrer of Waseda University in Tokyo. She is professor of sociology at the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies and director of the Institute of Asian Migrations at Waseda. She obtained her PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago, and her research focuses on international student and labor mobilities in Asia and Europe, and immigration and immigrants in Japan. Her recent publications include the Handbook of Asian Migration with Brenda Yao, published by Routledge in 2018. And she also has a very recent book, congratulations, Immigrant Japan, Mobility and Belonging in an Ethno-Nationalist Society, and a special issue on the question of skill in cross-labor mobility with Brenda Yao and Michelle Bass in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. So without further ado, I welcome our panelists and ready to engage in a very exciting and very important panel. So first, Professor Abe.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Takako and Michael. Well, it's a really great pleasure to participate in this event. And I'm so grateful that Michael invited me to join as a panelist rather than just an audience, so I can talk about immigration in Japan. And now, well, I just found out that, well, new book about Michael coming soon, and that is actually, well, without expecting that I'm going to kind of challenge his argument, probably. So, well, maybe later we may have very interesting discussion, or you can just bash me. Anyhow, so let me start with a very well-known general statement. Well, race and racism are concepts that are highly dependent on context and history. So there's no scientific differentiation that can define race. Instead, race is socially constructed to differentiate groups so that those who construct it can benefit from other groups. So what's happening and may happen in the face of increasing number of immigrants in Japan will look very differently from the race and racism in the United States or North America or other parts of the world, because we do have different historical background, and that, well, that apply to everywhere else. So the significance and intensity of the race issue in the United States is, of course, based on the country's own context, and Japan has a different context. So Japan has its own racism and racialization problem. And may I just one more time reiterate that the context is quite different. So for that matter, this is kind of challenging to say, but I am rather reluctant to use the terms and concepts of race to describe what Japan is facing or Japan is imposing upon migrants or other groups of people who can be termed as minorities. Instead, I often use the terms, or I see the problems we have is the intolerance to differences. In that sense, intolerance to multi-ethnicity, and we have these severe xenophobic problems. And we also are still kind of cursed by the myth of homogeneity. Well, already Professor Hikotani mentioned that it's not reality that Japan is a homogeneous society at all. That is the fact. And yet we still have this very strong belief in some conservative groups that Japan is supposed to be homogeneous, and Japan is homogeneous, which isn't, but then the belief is still right there. And as a result, we do have this very strong discrimination against others. So, you know, othering is the well, the problem that we face in the Japanese society. Professor of Anthropology of Kyoto University, Professor Takezawa Yasuko, points out that even before Japan faced the modernization in the 19th century, we already had the experiences of racialization to place outcast people like Eta and Hinin. So that racialization practice was repeated in the process of Meiji period modernization, and this time the terms were used like Burakumin, another outcast, and then to Ainu and Ryukyu Okinawans, to place all these people to the lower social orders. And admittingly, well, now we jump to the current period, immigrants from, say, Africa or Southeast Asia or African Americans, when they come to Japan, they tend to suffer more blatant discriminating treatment and languages, or well, abusive languages that happens. And then already Professor Hikotani mentioned Naomi Osaka, well, being the star in the professional tennis, and yet when she speaks out in political well, statements, then there are more bashings in Japan than anywhere else. And that is because, well, locals or Japanese nationals tend to focus on their complexions, while European-looking migrants may escape from similar insulting experiences. Also, there exists and remains hierarchical notion of white being superior and black being inferior, introduced in the 19th century modernization period. So I still, well, see this issue of racism in Japan, and yet I'm still uncertain whether using the concept of racialization to tackle with all kinds of discrimination happening in Japan that targets others who have different ethnic and or cultural background. So is it ethnicity or race or culture? Or what is really race in the Japanese context? So due to the sheer number of size and the groups among migrants or immigrants and their plus descendants, there are more Chinese and Koreans, and they are the main target of xenophobic attacks in Japan. Well, because of the length of time that they stay in Japan, or the Japanese, well, relations with those neighboring countries, and the current, well, diplomatic, well, dead end is also causing more well, harsh treatment to these minority groups in Japan. Well, plus, on the other hand, the more or most vulnerable in the socioeconomic downturn, such as now under the COVID-hit economy, they are the people, well, there are people particularly vulnerable are trainees among, well, trainees, and half of those trainees are now coming from Vietnam. So migrant workers tend to work in less stable positions in Japan that is irregular as opposed to regular employment. Then they are the first to lose the jobs, but then there are also quite a size of Japanese irregular employees too, who are losing jobs. And with the growing migrant population, which is still smaller in scale compared to North America or Western Europe, a Japanese version of multiculturalism, or we call it tabunka kyosei, multicultural coexistence, is much hyped at the government as well as civic levels. And still, there's a very strong pressure of assimilation in real life to those newcomers, migrants, particularly in terms of behavior and manners. Still, at least the discourse of multicultural coexistence promotes the idea that the Japanese society is consisted of people with increasing varieties of backgrounds. Gradually, though perhaps too slowly, people understand and accept that not all Japanese nationals look similar and not all community members have same Japanese citizenship, but rather people have different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. And such different people are also members of the same community. By receiving more migrants, Japan is having more varieties of people with different cultural and historical background than historically, well, bigger group of Koreans and Chinese. Well, this means that Japan is getting more multi-ethnic, even though Japan has never been mono-ethnic to start with anyway. So with those contexts, what I'm afraid is that if we declare that Japan has race issues, doesn't that mean that we assume migrants are of different race? And if we label problems that immigrants suffer as racism, then the terms have too strong influence and connotations from the US context, for example, so that we cement the difference between migrants or immigrants and the locals unnecessarily and fortify hierarchy that cannot be rationally substantiated at all. Also, I think neoliberalism force at present gives massive pressure to draw lines among people between useful for the nation and the capital on the one hand and not so useful on the other. So migrant labor is actually getting more and more welcomed as long as they are useful, even though they are not really accepted as part of the nation. When their usefulness wanes, then I fear they will be quickly racialized and then become even more vulnerable. And then again, I want to add that such things also happen to Japanese nationals too. Bashing towards people who live on social welfare, for example, is a very infamous example. So for a very short summary, I gave my inconclusive conclusion that immigration in the neoliberal political and social climate doesn't give optimistic outlook to me. But then I think we'd better be cautious about not to fall into the ready-made discourses of racism. Well, I appreciate any questions, comments, criticisms. Well, thank you very much to you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Abe, for your talk on racism and xenophobia and how Japan recognizes others within. And next we have Professor Chung, Racial Politics of Immigration in Japan. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank the Weatherhead East Asian Institute for sponsoring this event and Michael for organizing it. And I also want to thank my colleagues in Japan for participating at what is now a very late hour there. As Michael and Takako mentioned in their introductory remarks, Japan was one of the few liberal democracies where immigration did not occupy center stage in politics until recently. Despite labor shortages from the 1980s and an impending demographic crisis, immigration levels to Japan are much lower than they should be given the country's levels of development. And although the number of foreign nationals in raw numbers has grown at a rapid pace in recent years from about 850,000 in 1985 to over 2.9 million last year, foreign residents still make up only about 2% of the total population, which is especially stark given the record pace by which Japan's population is shrinking. Now, of course, we all know that immigration to Japan has provoked some volatile responses. And in recent years, we've witnessed the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment on the internet and on the streets even. And while these rightist movements may appear to echo their anti-immigrant rightist counterparts in Europe, there are two key differences. One is that Japan is the only former imperial power to which the largest flows of immigration occurred before 1945, not after. And unlike European countries, Japan maintained closed borders to unskilled immigration from the end of World War II until last year with the inauguration of a formal guest worker program. So consequently, anti-immigrant and especially anti-Korean sentiment isn't a backlash to open immigration policies that were enacted in the post-war era, but rather they're a reflection of their unresolved contradictions that stem from Japan's pre-war policies, as Atsuko was discussing. Now, in the not so many minutes that I have left, I want to just identify some distinguishing characteristics of immigration politics in Japan that I believe offer insights into how immigration, citizenship, and racial politics interact. So first, while Japan is not a traditional country of immigration, it nevertheless has permanently settled native-born populations of foreign residents within its borders and a long history of incorporating and excluding them, right? And in particular, the naturalization requirement for colonial era migrants and their descendants, most of whom are Korean, often referred to as Zainichi Koreans or Korean residents of Japan, has posed significant obstacles to their political incorporation, which has in turn given Japan the distinction of being the only mature democracy with a sixth-generation immigrant problem. Second, although Koreans are naturalizing at higher rates than ever before, the total naturalization rate in Japan remains among the lowest of all liberal democracies at less than 1% of the total foreign population. So it's been trailing, for example, South Korea and Taiwan for years now. And among recent immigrants, including ethnic Japanese or Nikkei immigrants from Brazil and Peru, the naturalization rate stands at less than 0.5% on average among non-Chinese nationals. Now, in contrast, permanent residency rates have grown rapidly from a little over 63,000 in 1995 to more than 1 million in 2015. And this is despite the fact that the residency requirement for permanent residency is double the 5-year residency requirement for naturalization. So foreign permanent residency has thus become the norm in Japan, despite the country's closed-door immigration policies. Finally, if phenotypical differences is the central marker for minority status in North America and Europe, then alienage is increasingly becoming the basis for how Japan's minorities relate to the state, how they mobilize themselves, and voice their collective interests. So I'm going to differ a little bit from Atsuko here. So unlike most non-European immigrants to Western Europe and North America, most migrants to Japan are from other Asian countries and are often physically indistinguishable from the majority population. And among native-born generations of Korean residents in particular, passing as Japanese is the most expedient way of avoiding discrimination, right? At the same time, passing goes beyond the act of non-disclosure, of simply not revealing one's Korean identity, because it involves the conscious act of concealing one's ancestry and oftentimes one's legal status. One Korean resident that I interviewed for my first book recounted how he felt on his first trip to Europe, right, outside of Japan, and I quote, "This was the first time I had ever been completely free of my identity. I didn't have to hide who I was. In these countries, I was simply yellow and Asian. I didn't have to negotiate any issues of identity. I didn't have to worry whether or not someone might suspect that I'm Korean. My identity was already marked on my skin. But as soon as I returned to Japan, I felt suffocated again. It was back to the pass or not pass dilemma." Another Korean resident went so far as to state that, quote, "Some Koreans wished they could look different from Japanese, like blacks do from whites," unquote. So for activists like my interviewee, this Korean community's social and political invisibility is the greatest obstacle to transforming Japanese society because it contributes to the idea that Japan is an ethnoculturally homogeneous society, as Atsuko explained, that does not require structural reforms, because if you don't have minorities, the logic is you don't have racism, right? And at the same time, it places the burden of avoiding discrimination on the individual immigrant who is expected to assimilate to the point of indistinguishability. I observed a similar trend in focus group interviews that I conducted with more recent immigrants for my book on immigrant incorporation in East Asian democracies, where I'm comparing immigration politics in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And in particular, the Chinese, South Korean, Filipino, and ethnic Japanese or Nikkei, Brazilians, and Peruvians all noted the pressure that they felt to make themselves invisible in Japanese society. And they also commented on the differential expectations for Japanese language fluency among Asian versus more visibly foreign immigrants. As a Chinese exchange student stated to me, quote, "My non-Asian foreigner friends have told me that Japanese are so friendly and helpful, and that sometimes they are treated better when they do not attempt to speak Japanese. Japanese people expect me to speak Japanese based on the way that I look. If I don't speak Japanese, then they think I'm stupid or lazy," unquote. And as a recent South Korean immigrant also put it, quote, "I feel we experience discrimination compared to foreigners with blonde hair. In my experience, when Westerners speak bad Japanese, they are praised. But when I speak bad Japanese, I've been ridiculed," unquote. But among phenotypically distinct Black and brown immigrants, however, visibility comes with other costs, right? For example, the Bangladeshi and Ethiopian male immigrants who were in my focus groups consistently brought up their experiences with police harassment. As one interviewee put it, quote, "In Japan, if your color is different, if your pronunciation is different, if your name is different, even if you have the paper," and he's referring to the Japanese passport, "you will not be recognized as Japanese. In the workplace, even on the road, police stop you everywhere you go," unquote. So the racial politics of immigration in Japan thus centers on the politics of visibility and invisibility. Equally significant is the fact that immigrants have mobilized themselves specifically as foreign residents rather than as politically incorporated racial and ethnic minorities, which has significant implications for the kinds of claims that they make to the state, as well as their patterns of incorporation. Unlike most historically disenfranchised communities elsewhere, Zainichi Korean activists, for example, have made claims to institutionalized rights as foreign residents permanently residing in Japan, which gave birth to what I call elsewhere a non-citizen civil rights movement that actually succeeded in removing the nationality requirement for social welfare benefits, civil rights protections, and even some public sector jobs by the early 1980s. And the increasingly visible presence of immigrants has led to the growth of hundreds of civil society organizations that provide support, services, and advocacy specifically for foreign residents. These grassroots movements have further led to subtle yet significant changes to the language of citizenship in Japan so that foreign residents are increasingly recognized as citizens of their local communities, as Atsuko mentioned. Ironically, Japanese officials have been resistant to immigration because they do not want the problems that they associate with racial and ethnic diversity in other democratic societies. Nevertheless, many of the hallmarks of racial and ethnic politics, such as economic and social dislocation, social and legal discrimination, and even a civil rights movement, have become the defining features of immigration politics in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chung. And now we go to Professor Liu-Farrer. Thank you. Oh, and she'll be talking about, growing up as immigrant children in an ethno-nationalist society. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Michael. I will share screen. Let me see. Okay. can you see or not? No. Okay, now. Oh,
Okay,
is it
now,
okay now? Okay,
yes,
thank
yes.
you. It is late and I'm not a late night person, so I think my brain is just functioning at like 40% capacity right now. So in case I cannot convey my ideas, at least you have something to look at. Well, thank you, Michael, for inviting me to the panel, to the workshop, and also thank you, Weatherhead, for organizing the event. It's great to see friends and colleagues remotely through Zoom. So my title here is Growing Up as X. The reason why I talk about X is because it really shows the difficulty for children to place themselves in the Japanese society as, you know, the children of immigrants, how they can identify themselves. So I think I try to find a topic that can be related to the topic of race and ethnicity. So I thought I would talk about the children. Okay, sorry. So, and the content is based on the book that I have just published and Michael has just kindly introduced, called Immigrant Japan. So this book is actually quite comprehensive, talks about why people come to Japan and how they are located in Japan's economy, why they want to stay, why they want to leave, and how they find a belonging. And there are 2 chapters I wrote about children. And basically, my argument is that Japan is an immigrant country, but is an ethno-nationalist one. And as the ethno-nationalist immigrant society, there are some characteristics, and I kind of summarize into 4 points. One is basically discursive denial of immigration. Second is anachronistic institutional practices. The third is pragmatism in immigration and settlement process that specifically talks about immigrants who try to find a way, jump through hoops to settle in Japan. And the last one is a possible but a difficult national belonging and impossible national identity. And these 2, the red items, actually today I want to talk about children's situation. I think that apply to children. And the anachronistic institutional practice, I'm talking about the education system in Japan. And so the children of immigrants, in fact, in 2017, there were close to 300,000 children with foreign nationality aged between 0 and 15 lived in Japan. And basically, the majority of them were from Asian countries. And of the, the 738,000 permanent residents, 16% of them were 22 years older or old or under, which means, given Japan's permanent residency kind of eligibility, they came as children. So, so children of immigrants, I talked about both children who were born to both immigrant parents, and also just one parent that has immigrant background, because their foreignness affects their experiences growing up in Japan. And also I want to emphasize that we cannot label these people 1.5 generation or second, because the transnationality among the children of immigrants in Japan are quite significant. And also they're very diverse, including both people, very well-educated children born to well-educated parents, and children born to very working class and not that well-educated parents. So I was talking about how in an ethno-national society as Japan, the institutional frameworks are anachronistic. And for me, the most difficult the transition, or the biggest problem, takes place in the education system. So basically, for immigrant children, where can they go to school? The majority of them go to the Japanese school. The Japanese school is provided, the education is provided, but not mandatory. So foreign children do not have to go to school, unlike it's not compulsory as for Japanese kids. And but Japanese school is is monolingual, monocultural. So it is very difficult for children to really fit in. They have to deal with language difficulties. Their parents have to deal with language difficulties, and the language support is oftentimes not adequate in Japanese schools for foreign children. And because they're different and they have to deal with a lot of harsh situations such as the bullying and under a lot of pressure for assimilation. As I think Atsuko also mentioned, it's just very a lot of pressure for people to be to assimilate. This is that's very typical of Japanese school, and as children, every children has a place, and everything needs to be kind of organized. There are other options for education. So when a lot of children of immigrants, when they cannot follow the Japanese programs, or when their parents are thinking they might end up returning, they will send children to foreigner schools. That actually is the name that Ministry of Education give to those sort of schools that teach in a language other than Japanese. So we have Brazilian schools, and also Brazilian schools are mostly schools for so-called Nikkei Brazilians, and the parents are hoping that children will go back to Brazil for further education, and also they themselves plan to go back to Brazil. And also education for settlement. For example, there are increasing amount of ethnic schools or foreigner schools that cater to ethnic communities who want to keep their children bilingual and stay in Japan. There are also other schools, and these schools also vary. Some the qualities are also very diverse. Some are cheap and less, the resources are poor. Some are, such as this one, which is American school in Japan, is very well endowed. And of course, there are also a lot of families send children back and forth, back to their own home country. So there are a lot of transnational educations going back and forth. I'm not going to get into the detail, but this is another education pattern. The reason why the education pattern exists, like there's so many, there are a lot of children go to ethnic schools or go transnational, partly because Japanese education system just cannot meet the demand of immigrant family and immigrant children, and their situation that families and children cannot cope with. Then the other issue that I want to kind of mention is the identity question. Growing up in Japan, you do not automatically become Japanese. In fact, none of the children I interviewed, over 50 children, none of them could call themselves Japanese. So Japan's ethno-nationalism, which identified Japaneseness, was a particular ethnic heritage, common descents. So this identity is so fixed. For children of immigrants, they feel this is not an accessible identity to them. So I see typically 3 patterns of identification. Here I use 3 cases. For example, the first type is passing, as Erin also mentioned. Some children try to pass as Japanese. This particular person is a Chinese who came from northeastern China. And he felt he was inferior. He always wanted to hide his roots. He never took friends to his family because his parents did not speak Japanese well. And then you also have person who identified themselves as acculturated gaijin. So even though they are perfectly acculturated, they can speak Japanese fluently, and culturally they're completely adapted, but they don't think they can become Japanese. So they use the term acculturated gaijin. And also there are people who are more cosmopolitan, who have been to different kind of international schools and international education. They try to embrace the identity, try to identify themselves as the global individual, like Kyujin, you know, the person of the earth and the global citizen. And none of them could actually say, I'm Japanese. Many of them express confusion as, you know, who they are, and they report the difficulty, you know, trying to kind of live with a particular kind of identity in Japan. So, you know, I'm not going to get into the detail because a lot of them went through the sort of school system, the bullying, and was forced to pass. Although in different contexts, if they go to ethnic schools, they might be more relaxed about their ethnic identity, and they try to cultivate different kinds of selves. And of course, after entering college and university, then they will open up and they realize actually their heritage might be a kind of advantage. And later on in the job market, especially for the Chinese and Koreans, they feel, oh, actually that has some advantage. So that sort of identity is a kind of evolving process.
Oh, so, sorry,
Yes.
just about a minute or so?
Yes. Okay, I'm wrapping up. And so basically for the children, I think they always kind of get caught in the kind of notions of blood, what constitutes Japanese, and they don't have the blood, or what makes Japanese and the kind of a culture, and this kind of blood equals culture equals nationality kind of equation excludes them from being included in Japan. And so this is the summary. You can just take a look. And what I try to emphasize is that actually Japan now is an immigrant country, and the second generation or 1.5 generations growing up. And I really feel if we want to confront the so-called the racial question in Japan, I think we have to think how this is going to form the context for the younger generation who are going to grow up in Japan. And I think we definitely don't want the same situation to, that happens to Europe to happen in Japan. So I think Japan is really is confronted with this situation. Thank you very much. Sorry for rushing through.
Thank you very much to Professor Liu-Farrer. Well, thank you very much to all the panelists for these really, really insightful words. And so I have a couple of questions for each of you, and then I'll open up to question and answer. So first thing I'd like to say is I hope that we aren't getting a very dim picture of immigration in Japan. It's a complex thing. I mean, the audience should know that in Japan, as you've all mentioned, immigration has increased considerably. You'll find foreign workers in every convenience store, right, in Japan. There are foreign workers from the airport to your residence. You're going to find non-visible, mostly non-visible, but also visible foreign workers. From sumo wrestlers to CEOs, right? There are people of foreign origin in both in positions of power, but also in positions of resistance, right? In Japan. So for Professor Abe, thank you very much again for that insightful discussion on racism and xenophobia. I think you asked some really telling questions about whether or not we should use the concept of race. But I'd like to say two things. One, you asked, are we creating a race issue that's not there, right? But also, you think about, it makes me think about other countries. For example, I studied the Netherlands as well. And in the Netherlands, there's a common narrative of oh, we're so liberal, there is no racism. And in a place like Brazil, oh, we're so tolerant. Actually, it's similar. We're so tolerant, we're so accepting, we're so multicultural. We can't be racist. And then in fact, what it ends up doing, as Erin mentioned, it actually ends up reifying the racism. So that's something to check out. Since some of your work is on on feminist political theory, I wonder if you could comment on how immigration in Japan is being feminized. Okay, that's for you. For Professor Chung, also really, really great stuff. I thought about something about whether or not in Japan a new racial hierarchy is being constructed of old and newcomers. So for the old comers, as you mentioned, there was a civil rights movement particularly amongst the Zainichi Korean community. But I also wondered about how visa status affects this racial hierarchy and possibilities for coalition building. For example, Zainichi Koreans, they can't be deported, right? But other newcomers can be. And you mentioned phenotype. How does phenotype and color play into all of this, right? How does this new racial hierarchy of old and newcomers, particularly with South Asians and Africans at the bottom, how does that affect the possibilities for coalition building? And how might we compare racism in Japan and the United States? Some might say that what we see in Japan is a type of xenophobia, but not necessarily racism. Is it misleading to use the term racism in discussing discrimination in Japan? So that kind of overlaps with Professor Abe's question. For Professor Liu-Farrer, very, very fascinating about Japan as an ethno-nationalist society and the constraints of that to inclusion. So I have some of my work has dealt with Nikkei Jin, Brazilian and Peruvian Nikkei Jin in Japan. So and I know you've I'm sure you've covered this, but how do you explain exclusion of Nikkei Jin? Nikkei Jin are actually blood descendants, right, of Japanese who have a special visa to go to Japan and live and work, but they find themselves excluded. How do you reconcile that exclusion with this idea of ethno-national identity? And in my interviews, when I was trying to figure out who deserves citizenship, Zainichi Koreans or Nikkei Jin, the politicians and policymakers I interviewed, they all thought that Zainichi Koreans should have citizenship rather than their co-ethnics. So so I would like to hear more about that. Oh, and also, how might this situation change? Okay, so I'll leave that and to answer those questions, and then I'll open it up. Thank you very much. Anyone can go first.
Do we follow the orders again, or
maybe that's the easiest way? Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I start answering. Well, thank you very much, Michael. And then, well, I also saw the chat, and then there are questions that actually can overlap with your question or comment as well. So the first one about okay, Japan may say that, oh, we don't really have racism because we don't really have that many other foreigners, even though we do. And then there are assimilated people, as Professor Chung mentioned, that there's invisible others there too, and they have to pass as Japanese, or they have this pressure to pass as Japanese, and so on and so forth. So, well, my point or my concern is that, yes, if you define racism very carefully, of course, we have racism and racialization issues in Japan, particularly in the historical flow of migration. And that it's not just current new wave of or sudden increase in the past 30 years, so to speak, but it is more to do with this imperial period. And then my concern is that the word race and racism in the Japanese narratives, it's just so much more well, tied towards the visually different others. And then, yes, we do have more migrants who look differently or who are more apparent with their differences. And still, if we focus on that part as the Japanese racism, then isn't it like ignoring the old pattern of racism or racialization towards those invisibly different, well, group of minorities? Well, that is the, well, in a way, dilemma that I feel. And the second question, well, about feminization, and that is actually kind of a wave. Historically, the migrant, well, in the contemporary Japanese migration flow had been feminized to start with, particularly in the 70s and 80s. Considerable number of Filipinas came to Japan to work as entertainment industry or sex works, or they came more as wives or, well, the brides, the Japanese man or male who typically are from the countryside, not being able to find their spouses. The local office set up the tour to go Taiwan or to China or to Thailand so that they can meet their brides. And it's only at the time of the bubble economy that it's the opposite of feminization that took place, as in there were more male migrants came in. So when your question was, so do I see the feminization? And it's always been there, is the, well, rather kind of simple answer. And about the targeting in this current COVID crisis in Japan, again, this is not really targeting towards certain groups in terms of ethnicity or race, for that matter. It is more to do with people who behave differently, people who don't wear masks, or people who don't follow the, well, social distancing, and people, especially the shops or restaurateurs or nightclubs that are open would have the harassing notes. And that is not to do with, well, whether they are minorities or, well, with different ethnic backgrounds or different racial groups. It is really to do with the mannerisms and behaviors that, that are whether coordinated to the majorities. So I don't know if other people may have different input to this.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Chung?
Yes. So, Michael, I think you're right that the influx of recent immigrants has certainly changed the dynamics of racial hierarchies and racial politics in Japan, and certainly has made phenotype as well as even definitions of who is Japanese, right? Distinguishing between Japanese, native Japanese nationals versus ethnic Japanese immigrants, the Nikkei, and also class, has become increasingly important in understanding racial politics in Japan. And in many ways, there are more sources of division between oldcomers and newcomers than solidarity. One, largely is structural, it's due to visa statuses, right? And the gap between, permanently settled, often native born and highly assimilated colonial era migrants and their descendants who have what's called a special permanent resident status, that basically, like you said, that it makes them almost akin to Japanese nationals, save voting rights. And then migrant workers, who weren't even acknowledged as workers until recently. And especially with, the economic shutdowns and the rise of racist, xenophobic narratives that link migrants and the coronavirus, migrant workers in Japan, have been denied entry into public places. They've been subject to verbal harassment and have been arbitrarily dismissed from their jobs, certainly not just in Japan, but throughout the world. And this has really underscored their precarious social and legal positions. At the same time, I think there is still a strong basis for coalition building based precisely around the foreign resident status. And what I found really interesting doing research for with the focus groups for my second book on immigrant incorporation in East Asian democracies was that even among the recent immigrants, there was a strong resistance to even the idea of naturalization, right? And some of this was a social thing. Some of the focus group participants would say, "Oh, I don't know anyone who's naturalized. All of my friends and all of my colleagues have attained permanent residency. I don't even know if I'm eligible to naturalize." So there was this kind of social dimension. But then there was also much discussion about the connotation that naturalization, kika in particular in Japanese, has, and the ways in which that's one, there's still a strong association with the colonial era, the forced assimilation policies, but also this idea that you have to give up, right? You have to give up your identity in order to become a Japanese national. Even though that's no longer even soft policy, there is still a very strong connotation even among recent immigrants. So what I think is interesting is that even among recent immigrants, there's more of a kind of move toward gaining permanent residency status and making claims to citizenship rights as settled foreign residents, and perhaps most importantly, really resisting naturalization and becoming more and more visible, right? So kind of resisting invisibility, and I think that's kind of the ways in which both oldcomers and newcomers have attempted to create this sense of solidarity around their foreigner status, but also around this movement to create visibility, to make racial politics actually a topic of public debate in Japan. And we certainly saw this in this summer's anti-racist protests in Japan and throughout the world. So even though we usually think about race and racial politics, through the prism of the US experience, which gives prominence to the role of phenotype, I still think that rather than thinking about kind of conflating race and saying that race is purely a relative concept, I think we need to actually view race more as a relational concept. And it's important to focus more on the consequences of discrimination and how racism can emerge in a number of different forms that go well beyond skin color. So this means examining, systematic patterns of racist ideologies, some of them based on Western classifications, scientific racism and white supremacy that have emerged in distinct geopolitical contexts, right? But also nativist ideas, discriminatory practices, and exclusionary policies that are nevertheless based on ascriptive criteria. And especially we need to focus on their political and material consequences, right? Because I think that by analyzing immigration, citizenship, and racial hierarchy as mutually exclusive categories, we run the risk of overlooking the racial dimensions of immigration and citizenship policies and practices, especially when state and social actors themselves avoid references to race. So rather, we need to look further at the actual patterns of racism, which involve not just day-to-day interactions, but also the policies that make these forms of discrimination actually matter.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay, I will jump in.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, and also just adding on to what Erin said, in Japan, in fact, there's a lot of kind of lexicon struggle. So instead of using race, jinshu, they use minzoku. So minzoku, it becomes a kind of replacement to race. And by saying minzoku, you automatically decides who is, who belongs here, who does not. So this sort of minzoku becomes kind of an exclusionary tool. And so along that line, I would just address Michael's question about Nikkei-jin. And I think Nikkei-jin, actually the import of Nikkei-jin as a labor itself is the ethno-nationalist policy, right? Because they consider these people as ethno-nationalists, and they didn't think they would stay long. But I think, as Erin also mentioned, this sort of hierarchy and exclusion are not necessarily just by this color or racial line, and it also is along the class and culture. So I think what distinguishes Nikkei-jin is that these people share a very specific economic structural position. They were channeled from Brazil directly to this automobile factories or electronic assembly lines, and so their structural position is so defined and so in a sense, and also their employment situation is so precarious. So they become kind of economic, kind of lower class, and that affects their assimilation. And so their experience as ethnic Japanese was kind of negated. Their identity was negated by their kind of class position in Japan. And I think that kind of, because ethno-nationalism is on both sides. Somebody excludes you, and you also interpret that exclusion as ethno-nationalist. So because of that, Nikkei-jin decides they really, actually they are rather Brazilian instead of Japanese. And also culturally, they feel that's a very big barrier because many of them don't speak Japanese that well. And the other thing is, as you also probably noticed, among those Nikkei Brazilians, actually, it's not just Japanese, and it's a very mixed racial group. Most families are mixed, so that actually, phenotypically, they're not Japanese as well. But right now, as an immigrant group, they are the most precarious, and their children have the lowest high school attendance and graduation rate. And among all the immigrant children, they have the worst education mobility. They actually are the one group has intergenerational downward mobility. So because of the economic position, and their parents were put in, which directly determined how they could, what kind of opportunity they had for upward mobility. And how might the situation change? Interesting, I noticed that Hillary also has this question with all those specified skilled workers, all that sort of, opening doors to immigrant workers. Japanese government has been trying. They came up with this comprehensive plan. In fact, I was approached by Ministry of Justice. Now they set up this Gaikokujin Xien Center, foreigner support center. They want me to train them. And also, so it's so funny because lately I feel like I got a lot of, I've been approached by some of the local governments like Nakanoku, wanting me to help them to design the kind of programs that could include children. So I'm also thinking how I can, do that. So I think it is something that's happening. I've been in Japan for over 20 years. I see the change. And so I think that Japan, for one thing, I think that the Japan's racism, unlike American racism, is not violent. I mean, on average, there's still some sort of civility. I know there are a lot of violence against Zainichi, and especially in Kansai area, but in general, toward immigrants is not that violent. So I think in a sense, there's this kind of civility that's still there, and it makes Japan still an attractive society for immigrants. But about this COVID, I think there's always discrimination on internet, but there are always counter discourses. People always try to, balance that out. And in fact, I also saw a the other day, TV program talking about in Gunma-gen, the majority of infected cases were among immigrants. They actually put it in the news, and that alone actually could make me a bit kind of startled. So they are actually, still considering this sort of issues through this Japanese and foreigner kind of lens, and also the policy against foreigners to leave Japan or to come back to Japan, in a sense, is really like drawing a line. So who is going to obey the rules? The foreigners are less trustworthy in following all those kind of a mask mandate and all that sort of thing. So there is still this line there.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much. I see that Dr. Holbrook of Harvard here has a question. And I think many of you have touched on it, but just in case anybody else wants to say a bit more, how do you think the new the designated skills visa introduced last year will change Japanese attitudes or policies towards foreign workers going forward? And how might activism by foreigners and Japanese for better treatment of foreigners in Japan change as more workers come to Japan under the new visa? Let's see, I'll just put these together and see, because we only have a few minutes. There's another from Karen Narita. I'm a PhD student at Queen's Mary University of London, researching conservative ideology in Japan. My question is for all the panelists: why has there been ethno-nationalism as part of right-wing culture since the end of World War II? Racialized anti-immigrant discourse has increased since the 1990s. One of the most commonly cited reasons for the timing has been the so-called comfort women issue and the conservative backlash against official apologies for wartime atrocities. Do the panelists think that there have been other structural issues regarding race and immigration which have contributed to this rise at this historical moment? So feel free if anyone wants to take on either one.
Just to maybe think about both of them together, I think that the new visa categories from last year will not necessarily contribute to heightened anti-immigrant sentiment, in large part because what we see, the anti-foreign movements, as others have mentioned, have largely been directed at Koreans and, to a lesser extent, Chinese, and especially their so-called special privileges. So most of them have stemmed more from the colonial legacies in Japan's unresolved historical issues and the ways in which these still unincorporated colonial era migrants and their descendants have made claims to rights without becoming Japanese nationals. So that's in reference to the special privileges, and not so much to the recent immigrants. And if anything, I've argued elsewhere that one of the reasons why we are seeing an expansion of the industrial trainee program alongside the guest worker program, rather than the eradication that we saw in South Korea's case, where South Korea had an identical industrial trainee system, but then shortly after it adopted its guest worker program, it eradicated the industrial trainee system due to its systematic exploitation and abuses and so forth. But Japan has made no legislative moves to do so, right? And I argue that this is actually reflective of kind of the politics of invisibility again, because the industrial trainee system has been remarkably efficient in allocating trainees in really depopulated areas that need the most labor, right? And they've actually become the invisible foreigners that the Nikkei immigrants were supposed to be, right? There is assumption that co-ethnic immigrants were going to be the invisible immigrants because of their co-ethnicity, but in fact they became highly visible immigrants. But it's actually precisely the industrial trainees, largely because of their geographical and occupational kind of dispersion, they've actually become the invisible migrants. And that's why I think there hasn't been as much of this kind of backlash against these recent immigrants.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. Unless anyone else has anything else to add, well, maybe we can continue the discussion through email. But I just wanted to say, on behalf of Columbia University's Weatherhead East Asian Institute, I thank all of the speakers for their insightful remarks. Dr. Hikotani for her generous introduction, and the audience for your comments. I'd like to also thank Athena Fontecao for her help. We hope that this conversation helps to advance the subject of immigration and racism in Japan, and health and safety to you and your families. Thank you very much.